Okay, good morning, everyone. I have a feeling that more people will be trickling in as breakfast sort of continues to work its way towards closure, but I would like to get started because, as you indicated, we have what to do this morning, something to accomplish. My name is Naftali Hoff, and I come to you from a background in education. I spent about 15 years in the classroom, as well as concurrent for most of that, a number of years in school leadership and administration. And so I'm going to stand up here pretending that I know what I'm talking about in the area of parenting, but I will tell you that of all the topics that I presented to Aish as possibilities for my talk this morning, I was really delighted that they chose this one. And the reason I say that is because anytime I prepare a lecture, I learn a lot more about the topic. Invariably, you always want to go back, and you always want to prepare, and really be current and up to date in whatever it is that you're discussing. And so whenever I can learn a little bit more about parenting, it's something that helps me as well as helps my kids, and certainly if I can share some of those ideas, I think I was a great parent over Shabbos this week. Because every time I had a moment, and I had quite a few, I said to myself, is this the kind of person that should be getting up tomorrow morning and saying something on the topic? And my wife very gently reminded me of the same. So in that context, here I am, and I'm delighted to be with you this morning. So, I'm taken by the relative, actually significant increase in parenting focus, I would say, over the last 10 years or so. Anyone who gets the newspapers, anyone who's online looking at blogs and whatnot, parenting has really become a topic of interest for so many of us. And for many of us, a topic of concern, or perhaps even crisis in some cases. And I'm struggling a little bit in my own mind to think about why is that so? Why is it that we have really made parenting such a focus? And of course it's so important. We know that we'll talk more about that. But I think as a generation and as a society, there are challenges that we are confronted by. There are issues that we deal with today that may be unique to us. For example, some recent statistics associated with parents in the workplace. So it used to be, in the year 1980, that 32.5% of households here in the United States had both parents working on a full-time basis outside of the home. That number today is above 53%. It's about 54%, and perhaps even growing. The statistics end about 2009, which today's day and age can move significantly in just a few years' time. So we're away from home much more than we used to be. And not only that, we bring, even when we are home, we struggle to be present. We struggle to be present. If you're like me, you have some kind of device affixed to your hip very frequently, thank goodness for Shabbos. It's the one time we really can power down. But outside of that, it can be extremely difficult for us. I was reading, I Googled just the other day, parenting trends of today or changes in parenting over the last however many years. And one mother writes, she said, when I gave birth to my children, I was able to sit there and have the baby with me, and he or she was my sole focus. But if I would be giving birth today, who's to say that I wouldn't have my cell phone with me, texting and responding to emails as I'm holding the baby? Now imagine being a baby coming into the world with that type of interaction. Imagine being a child coming into the world with that level of connection, disconnection, however you want to phrase it, with that level of competition for your attention, for competition for what's really important to you. I saw not that long ago, Nature Valley, they make those granola bars. Really good stuff. And they had a commercial, I'm not sure exactly what motivated them, this video where they were talking about kids being so connected to the internet, so connected to social media, so connected to texting and whatnot, that they were disconnecting from nature. They were disconnecting from the world around them. And kids today just aren't playing as much as they used to. They aren't interacting as much as they used to. And we know how important it is. We know how important it is for us to be talking with one another, solving problems, engaging in ideas. To digress for just a second, when I was in one of my graduate programs in education, I had a professor, I had started my master's here in City College, and I got married to my wife who was from Chicago, so I finished it out in Chicago. And a suburb of Chicago is a town called Schaumburg, Illinois. Schaumburg happens to be the home of Motorola. And Motorola, the professor the course that I was taking, he was teaching methodology of social studies. And he had a conversation with an executive over at Motorola. He said, you guys in education, you have it all wrong. He said, what do you mean? We're experts, we know what we're talking about. How do you know what we're doing or not doing? That's correct. He said, because nowadays you're graduating kids that are all into self-work. They're all into focusing on their own capabilities, no cheating, no talking, no transferring of ideas. And then to come to us, we have to deprogram them and reprogram them to become collaborative, to become communicative, to become engaged. And I don't think we can call texting engagement. I don't think we can genuinely call engaging online as true communication, especially because they don't even write complete words, let alone complete sentences. So we're not teaching them how to communicate very effectively. So we've got these challenges. And even if that challenge is not personally relevant to you, there's a fascinating story involving the Vilna Gaon, who was one of the great sages of the last 500 years, probably the preeminent sage, and he lived in the town of Vilna, modern-day Lithuania. And so the story goes that he was speaking to a community and was talking about Shabbos, the importance of keeping Shabbos, the seriousness of the day, and all of this. But everybody in the room was Shomer Shabbos. Everybody in the room already kept Shabbos. So what exactly was he trying to accomplish? And he was asked that question afterwards. He said, Rabbi, we're all Shomer Shabbos over here. Why are you talking about something that we already do? He said, because, and this is 18th century firefighting, so I don't know if it's still 100% relevant today, but you do see evidence of this. He said, because when there's a fire, and the fire has already significantly consumed a building, the firefighters now turn their attention to the surrounding areas. They start putting water on the nearby homes and the nearby areas because the greatest concern to them at this point is for that fire to spread. And I don't want to be an alarmist, but I think it's safe to say that we live in a society, we live at a time where there's a fire raging within our communities, a fire raging within the world as a whole, struggling with foundational issues such as parenting. And when you're dealing with people who are having a hard time managing their time, maintaining work-life balance, dealing with the things that are really important to them because they're being pulled in so many directions. You turn on your computer, you open up Outlook or Gmail or whatever it is, boom, you have all these emails and you have to decide to respond, not to respond. What are my priorities? When you sit down at the dinner table, where is our phone? All of these kinds of things. And so even if all of us are not there and we're in a so-called better place, it's still important to realize that there's a challenge out there. And our responsibility for ourselves is to make sure that it doesn't spread into our environments. And so that's the context by which I bring today's conversation. And I'd like to say that I think today, Erev Chanukah, is a beautiful time to talk about parenting. You know, there are different holidays that have different themes naturally associated with it. And our sages say that there's actually a special spiritual flow that comes down from heaven at particular times of year that allow us to engage in a specific type of way with that Chag. So for example, on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, we know that we have a special ability to connect with our misdeeds and to be able to talk to Hashem and to beg forgiveness and to hope for a new year to be more positive than the year before. Sukkot is all about divine protection. I actually think Sukkot is the most underrated holiday on the Jewish calendar. If you think about it for just a moment, 3 million Jews wandering in a desert with no natural provisions whatsoever. Imagine, for example, I used to tell my students, imagine how many shopping carts your parents come home with on a weekly basis just to feed your family. And imagine the food requirements, imagine the shelter and clothing requirements, all of these kinds of things. And we're talking about 3 million people for 40 years. All of them sustained by heavenly bread, by an ongoing supply of water, by clothing that never rubbed out, by housing that was permanent, so to speak. It was temporary, but at least it was ever present for them. That's a tremendous thing. And so Sukkot, we have the schach, we're able to look up, we remind ourselves of God's intervention. We remind ourselves that no matter what kind of beautiful homes we live in, no matter what kind of beautiful lives we built for ourselves, at the end of the day, without Him, we have nothing. And every holiday offers that. Pesach offers the opportunity to have redemption, not just the historic redemption, but the personal redemption. Chayav Adam Liros Etzatzel, we have an obligation to see ourselves, Kilu Hu Yatsa Mitzrayim, as if I am leaving Egypt today. And it's not just putting some little satchel on our back, walking around singing, and taking some scallions and whipping each other. That's nice. That's good. But it's a real understanding of freedom. Freedom from our trappings, freedom from our Yetzer Hara, our evil inclination. So Hanukkah is about light. And interestingly enough, even though Hanukkah is really about a battle, the essence that we celebrate, the thing that we focus on is the light. Because it was really a battle about spirituality and about the Jewish future. It wasn't that their physical well-being was threatened, assuming that they would conform. The Greeks never threatened us physically in that way. It's the only exile in which there was no exile, in a physical sense of the term. Right? The Babylonians exiled us, before them the Assyrians. The Persians were sort of on the tail end of the Babylonians. Then there were the Greeks, who at this point are really Syrian Greeks, which maybe we'll explain if we have time. And then you have the Romans. All of the nations that I just mentioned physically exiled us from our land, with the sole exception of the Greeks. They exiled us exclusively in a spiritual sense, but it's nonetheless a very powerful exile, and in many ways the harshest of them all. In fact, the Torah alludes to it when it talks about Choshech. The Choshech al Panei Tehom, at the very beginning of Genesis, that there was darkness. Our sages say, Choshech zu Yava, darkness that refers to the Greeks, which if you think about it seems strange, because they're all about culture, they're all about philosophy, they're all about the beauty of the human being, the mind, and all of that. But because in ways that we can't get into today, they were fundamentally opposed to the beauty and to the light of Torah, the way we understand in our sages, that therefore represents darkness. And so we today, gathering together to talk specifically about the transmission of Torah to our children, the idea that we have an opportunity to make that connection really be the next link in the chain. Right? It is a chain. It's a beautiful chain. It's an anomaly within history. It doesn't make sense. All of the great thinkers that talk about what is the greatest evidence of God, they talk about us. We're the greatest evidence because we should not be here. Based on any natural law, we know as small, persecuted, without autonomy, moving from place to place, always being, even when we think we're no longer dealing with anti-Semitism, post-Holocaust here in America and in the world, we see it rearing its ugly head again. And we recognize that the only way that we can survive and do survive is because God is with us. And so now is a great time, I think, to talk about Chanukah. But I think it goes deeper than that. Because if you think about the shoresh, the root of the word Chanukah, ches, nun, chaf, means to dedicate, in this case to rededicate the second Beit HaMikdash, which had been defiled by the Greeks. That same shoresh is that of chinuch, which is the word we use for education. It's kind of a funny word for education. It doesn't come from the word really, lamad means to teach. But chinuch is deeper than just teaching or transferring information. It's about dedicating and raising potential. And I'd like to quote to you, if I can, something from Rav Kalonymus Kalman of Piaseczna, who was one of the great Torah scholars at the time of the Second World War. He died in Warsaw during the war itself. And he says like this: Chinuch refers to realizing the inherent capability for whichever task or the capability of a house or an object to fulfill its function. When it is used to refer to the education of children, then the meaning is to raise and develop the child's nature and capabilities. So that means we're talking about taking the inherent capability within a child, and every child has that. Every child is gifted in different ways. And for us to be able to identify it, to tap into it, and to raise it, and to help it flower. So that, as the rest of the pasuk says, Gam ki yaskin lo yaslim mimenu. So that as this individual ages, grows, matures, and develops, he will not deviate from it. Because the foundation was so strong, the connection in those early years was so profound, that there's no way that I'm going to deviate. How could I? I'm so closely connected to the idea. And that's therefore a very good time, I think, to talk about chinuch. And if I may add to it, the story of Chanukah itself has a lot of chinuch built into it. Right? We all know the famous story of Hannah and her 7 sons. And we know Hannah, and she goes in front of the king, and he's trying to get her to bow down. He's trying to get her sons to bow down. And each of them defy the king and refuse to do so. Even the trick which he comes up with, just pretend to pick up my ring, right, so that it looks like you're bowing, and the kids won't do any of that. And all of them lose their lives. Where do you develop such a commitment? Where do you develop such a temerity? Where do you develop such a deep sense of identity of what's right and what's wrong, if not for the chinuch of Hannah and or the father, whoever that might have been in that particular story? This is a story of chinuch. We know as well Matisyahu, when he rises up in the small hamlet of Modi'in, and there was a situation where the Greek garrison was offering or wanted to offer a swine, and that the Jews should participate. And they called him Matisyahu because he was the elder of the community. You go up there and you provide that service. He refused to do so. And he gets up and he screams, Bila Hashem Elah, and he kills the garrison. They wipe out the Jew also who performed that particular service. And his sons follow after him. And the 5 sons of Matisyahu are really the ones who lead the battle moving forward. Where does that level of commitment come from? If not for a deep sense of chinuch, a proper training. And we also know that the dreidel that we spin, one of the highlights of Chanukah, is really a commemoration of a story where the teacher and the students who knew that they couldn't learn Torah publicly, knew that it was against the law and punishable by death, they would go out and they would play ostensibly, really learning Torah, but keeping that available to them so that any time somebody suspicious came nearby, certainly if there were any soldiers nearby, they could just say, oh, we're just playing games. We're having fun. We're just enjoying ourselves together. And they would quickly hide their scar and they'd hide their books. So chinuch is ever present in the story of Chanukah. And if we realize that the light of the menorah is really symbolic of the light of teaching, of the light of Torah, of the light of Masorah, the light of transmission, then I think it's really a germane time and a very appropriate time for us to be talking about chinuch and to see what ideas can we develop together that ultimately will help us all become better as parents and as, I would say, even members of our community. So I like to work with acronyms. I think it helps me remember things. And so I took the word chinuch, and I wrote it into English. And the word chinuch, if you divide it CH, and then I, and N, U, and then CH, those will be our 5 talking points today, the 5 strategies that we will focus on, and I will mention each of those in sequence as we move forward. So the first CH stands for character. And it's really important for all of us as parents to work on our character. And we have to realize that our kids notice everything about us. Okay, if you have older kids in particular and they've ever done an imitation session of you, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, they got us down to a science. And we really have to be very, very careful to model our character, especially in their presence. Although it's good to practice when not in their presence as well. Now the Gemara in Sukkah tells us, Shusa di'anuka b'shuka, o da'avuha, o di'imeh. The talk of the child in the marketplace is either that of his father or that of his mother. Now I have a 2-year-old, 2.5-year-old, and he's got all the language down. He's imitating his siblings, he's imitating his parents, he's got everybody's language. And so I see that evidence firsthand. So working on our character is extremely important because you are the transmitter. Remember, chinuch doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not like you submit to your children, here's that book, here's the how-to guide of being a good kid. Here's the how-to guide of growing up to be, a positive contributor to the Jewish nation and as a world, as an international citizen, let's call it. There is no such thing. It certainly wouldn't work very well. It's given over to us. It's a tremendous responsibility. If you think about it biologically, there is no species in the world that has so much natural dependence as we do. Most other mammals, or most other creatures, whatever they are, when they are born, they need a small period of time of dependence where they're surviving based on the mother's support, whether that's a bird giving worms and whatnot to the child, whether it's a mammal who's living off the mother's milk. But in a relatively short period of time, they're walking, they're flying, they're doing, and they're basically independent. Our independence may never arrive. And if it does, it certainly doesn't arrive for a while, right? Our kids need us for a really long time. And that's by design. Because it's not intended for us to just sort of have the child and then let them be off on their merry way. We are ever present in their lives. And that's a very powerful thing and can be a very beautiful thing, so long as we obviously are doing the right thing on our own. Now there's a story where a rabbi was teaching a class, I think this took place in Israel, where they take the responses perhaps a little bit more seriously than here in the States. And they're going around and what's the most important thing in the world? And most of the kids are saying, Hashem, God, Torah, things like this. And one kid pipes up, and I think he had a little bit of a reputation as it was. And he says, Chalt. And of course, the rabbi's not all that pleased with him. He thinks he's mocking him. He said, I'm sorry, what did you say? Could you say that again? And he says, Chalt. And he's all miffed, sends him out to the principal. So, in conversation with the principal, the principal says, "What do you mean? Or what are you saying over here?" And the boy says, and he's angry about it, you can tell. He said, "Every time I sit down at the Shabbos table, they have a Dvar Torah to share at the Shabbos table. Maybe he wants to sing a few songs, whatever it might be. And my father's there and he's listening, but he's not really listening because he's in his challah." Right? Now that must have been a wicked challah. But that means that no matter what, the message that the father was conveying to this boy was that the most important thing at the Shabbos table is me and my food. Now, you are there, I'm looking at you, but I'm really not with you. Being present for a child is extremely important, right? And that has to do with making eye contact. That has to do with being able to repeat on occasion what the child has to say, following up with a question. Rabbi Avi Shulman, who's one of the well-known educators and speakers within many of the circles, so to speak, once talked in a context where I was present about, he was running a program when he was much younger, and he went to different schools to pitch the program. It was an after-school learning program. And he talked about two particular principals that he was with. One of them he spent about an hour with, one of them he spent about 5 minutes with. The first one gave him all the time in the world, but he was interrupted constantly, not with his phone, this was back in the day, not with this phone, but with the other phone, by his secretary, by other things that were coming up. So even though he was physically present, he wasn't feeling the presence. The other principal said, "I really don't have a lot of time. I'd love to hear from you. I can only give you 5 minutes." But those 5 minutes, he shut down everything. The phone was away, didn't take any calls, not interrupted. He gave him eye contact, he was present. And therefore, he made those 5 minutes feel much more longer and substantial than the hour that he received from the other gentleman. And that's an important piece. As we talk about characters, we talk about connecting, is really being there in body, in mind, in every respect. Now, there's a poem. I don't know if I'll be able to read the whole thing to you, but I think it's very powerful. It's called "Children Learn What They Live." And it was written by Dorothy Law. I don't even know how to pronounce her last name. If a child lives with criticism, he learns to condemn. If a child lives with hostility, he learns to fight. If a child lives with fear, he learns to be apprehensive. If a child lives with pity, he learns to feel sorry for himself. If a child lives with ridicule, he learns to be shy. If a child lives with jealousy, he learns what envy is. If a child lives with shame, he learns to feel guilty. If a child lives with encouragement, he learns to be confident. If a child lives with tolerance, he learns to be patient. If a child lives with praise, he learns to be appreciative. If a child lives with acceptance, he learns to love. If a child lives with approval, he learns to like himself. If a child lives with recognition, he learns that it is good to have a goal. If a child lives with sharing, he learns about generosity. If a child lives with honesty and fairness, he learns what truth and justice are. If a child lives with security, he learns to have faith in himself and in those about him. If a child lives with friendliness, he learns that the world is a nice place in which to live. If you live with serenity, your child will live with peace of mind. With what is your child living? And I think it's a very powerful question for all of us, right? The way we are, the context, the environment that we create, that's the world in which our child lives. And we're all familiar with the adage that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. For those of you who were not here when I first started, I mentioned that I was a teacher as well as a principal. I can tell you with pretty strong assurances that that is a very accurate statement in most cases. There are always exceptions. There are always exceptions. But in most cases, you see a lot of similarity between parent and child. And if the child is doing things that are challenging in the classroom, one of the questions I was trained to learn about myself.
Did anyone in this room leave a black bag, briefcase? In this room over here? Anyone? No? Okay.
So I was taught to think, in my, not to say it, of course, I never want to say it, but to think in my mind, well, what's going on at home? And what are the challenges and the realities for this child? And that really can make a big difference. Now, sometimes it has nothing to do with the character of the parent. It might have to do with what time the kid's going to sleep, what other issues they're dealing with. Sometimes it's not their fault. It's beyond their control, illness, things like this. But we all recognize that we as parents have a significant role in the model that the children see every day. And so it's really important for us to keep that in mind. Now, when you are doing good things, part of us were trained in Jewish tradition to be humble. And so we don't like to talk about what we do. But I know Rabbi Pesach Krohn has said many times, I've heard it, that he says that you really do need to tell your children what you were involved in. If you have a study session, a chavruta, do it in their presence, at least on occasion. Tell them that you're going to study. Let them know about the good things you do, because they ultimately need to be able to connect to that and want to be able to emulate that. There's a story that he writes in a book, unfortunately the sad side, the alternative side of this, about a man who was walking in the streets of Jerusalem. And he gets to the house, he passes by a house, and somebody from within says, "Please come in, we need a minyan." It's a shiva house. Somebody inside is unfortunately mourning for the loss of a relative. And he comes inside and he sees three sons, or three men, all wearing kippot that don't seem to look right. We've all seen those, kind of perched, not exactly looking very natural. But the house is filled wall to wall with svarim. The house is filled with Jewish books, all sorts of texts, Talmud, Chumash, you name it, it's there. Looks like the person who lived there was deeply religious. But the people who are sitting in front of him clearly do not seem connected at all. So the person is sitting there, they make the minyan, he is about to leave, he says the hamakom phrase. Before he walks out, he says, "I can't help it, please forgive me. Can you explain to me what I'm seeing over here? You don't appear to be all that connected, and yet the house clearly speaks to that connection very deeply." And they said, "Those Sfarim belonged to our father. And our father every day would learn. He'd go into the study in the wall, and they pointed where that door was, where the study was. He'd go in there and he'd lock the door. And he'd be in there for hours all day. And he didn't connect with us. We really had nothing to do with all of that. And so over time we became disconnected and disenfranchised. He was definitely doing the right thing from a Torah perspective, but it never involved us. And so we really aren't part and parcel of that. So really the good that you do, whether it's packing boxes for tzedakah, for poor people, whatever that chesed is, whatever that mitzvah is, the more that you can involve your child, the better. Minimally inform them of what you're doing. Let them see that your heart, your mind, and your actions are in the right place. And they will learn from that and get inspired by it. So that was CH, character. The I stands for instruct. We have to be willing to be instructors for our children. In today's day and age, we have this concept that let the school handle the education, I'll be the parent, right? And we sort of outsource a lot of the educational pieces. And we'll talk about what may be appropriate in that regard and what isn't. But we need to realize that we have to be instructors for our children. In 21st century education, one of the trends, or I think one of the challenges, is that our children are not used to being told what to do in many cases. They certainly aren't necessarily asked to work all that hard. Certainly compared to my generation, right? When I was young, anyone feel like that, right? We all reference back in the day. But that's the truth. We live in a changing environment. And the reality is that we oftentimes are very much afraid, especially those who either have in their own family or know situations of what we often call at risk, of kids that are not staying consistent with our values and are experimenting in ways that we are not happy with, right? Which, by the way, in many cases is actually in risk if they're actually doing those behaviors. At risk are kids who are at risk of becoming in risk. It's a different in the nomenclature. But regardless, you're talking about people who may be a little bit gun shy. I'm afraid to be too strong with my child because I'm afraid that that might push the child away. But we have to realize that our kids really need that. They want that from us. They will never tell you they want it. They'll never admit that they want a firm hand. But every child wants to be in a secure environment. Everyone wants to have that moral compass. Everybody wants to have somebody to turn to and say, what do I do here? And even if they refuse to up front, at some point, typically speaking, they will cycle back to you because they know that you are there for them and they know that you really represent an important piece in their maturity, in their development of their ideas and all of this. So you have to think as an instructor. You really have an important role as a parent in the chinuch of your child. Now, one of the points of evidence of this, which I find fascinating, has to do with Avraham Avinu. Now, you might recall that before God went and destroyed the 5 cities, including Sodom, he first sent the angels. And in that context, Avraham is informed of their ultimate mission. And so Abraham goes and he davens to Hashem and he says, if there are 50 righteous people, right, don't destroy. Hashem says, I won't. 45 in that whole sequence. Now, why is it, prior to that, that Hashem says that I'm going to tell Avram. He says, how could it be that I'm going to destroy these cities and not tell Abraham, Avram about it? And the pasuk says as follows, it's unbelievable. For I have known him because he commands his sons and his household after him, that they should keep the way of the Lord to perform righteousness and justice. It doesn't say in the pasuk that I should tell Avram because he was Moser Nefesh, because he gave up his life, in the story of the Kivshan Eish in the fiery furnace. It doesn't say because Avram, without asking any questions, relocated his entire family. It doesn't say because Avram stood up against the mighty Nimrod and presented a monotheistic concept that nobody else in the world was espousing at the risk of his own life. None of that. It simply says, I'm going to tell Abraham because he's going to be the one who transmits the Masorah to his children. Now, why that is perhaps a conversation for another time. But the point is, you see the importance of chinuch. The point is, you see that it's not enough to just view chinuch as sort of a peripheral aspect of what we do. We have the children, Baruch Hashem, but then we have to really be part and parcel of their lives and provide them with direct guidance and instruction, how to behave, what to think, all of these things. And we say in the Torah, V'shinantam levanecha, we say it in Kriya Shema. Right? It's really the father's responsibility. Education as we know it today, I wouldn't say it's a relatively new concept, but it certainly doesn't date back from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu and before him, the Avot and Imahot, etc. It used to be that chinuch was the responsibility of the parents in a more concrete sense. Over time, we developed educational systems because we couldn't function otherwise, dating back to the second Beit HaMikdash and since then. And of course, today we are blessed with a universal Jewish education, at least model, where we're able to educate our kids from the youngest years to post-college, right? Whether that be university, graduate school, whether that be kollel or some other type of Torah learning. We have the ability to educate. It used to be 100 years ago. If you were in Europe, right, typically speaking, kids were educated till about the year of bar mitzvah if they were lucky. And that's usually the kids that were very wealthy or extremely capable and the parents really put out for them. It wasn't the universal norm like it is today. We have that opportunity, but that does not in any way exempt us. It doesn't remove our responsibility to be present in their lives and to give them that. And Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, who's one of my own personal sources of inspiration and the great rabbi, one of the great rabbis in 19th century Germany, was the leader of the Frankfurt Jewish community at a time of significant reform, when the future of Orthodoxy, at least in Germany, was very much at stake. And he rose up and really created this revolutionary concept called Torah and Derech Eretz. Whether you say he created it or just distilled it from earlier sources and made it more preeminent is not relevant right now. What he talks about is a fascinating volume. It's a little bit wordy because it's a translation of the original German. But if you can get your hands on this book, I would encourage all of you to do so. It's called The Collected Writings of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, Volume 7. Volume 7 is the education volume, and it's pretty thick. There are not too many rabbinic sources, certainly well organized, like this one. And it talks about a lot of aspects of what chinuch is really all about. Some of it you might find a little archaic, because again, it was written 150 years ago, roughly, but I will tell you most of it is as relevant today as it was when he wrote it. And he talks about two different types of education: spiritual education and moral education. He says spiritual education, which is maybe what we call the information, how to learn text, things about the Chagim, the holidays, whatever that might be, that typically we can give over to the school and make that the responsibility of the Rebbe, of the Moed. But the moral education, the character, which unfortunately today I believe has become too much the responsibility of the school, really belongs squarely in the lap of the parent. We're really the ones who the children can see modeling that, not just in a classroom in sort of this distilled environment where everything is nice and clean and generic and we could just talk about ideas. Parents are the one who show Judaism when things are tough. They show it Erev Shabbos 5 minutes before Lichbenchen when 4 kids haven't showered yet and I still haven't put up the whatever, right? That moment of crisis. Or any other family situation. And how to prioritize visiting this one or doing this for that one or dealing with an irate neighbor, whatever the challenge may be. When they see the parents in action and we're modeling that right behavior, that's really the moral education 101. And that really, according to Rabbi Hirsch, is our responsibility first and foremost. So we need to be willing to do that. You have to be able to insist on your own kavod as well. something we have a hard time doing in today's day and age. But really, that's what Judaism is all about. The halacha makes very clear that we have something called mora av va'in. We have to ask our children, even if it's not easy for us because we don't want to insist on it, to stand in our presence, to not sit in our seat, to not use the things that are distinctly ours, not for us, but for them. We have the same idea with tefillah. We don't pray to God because God needs to know what we need. Right? If you think about it in its essence, if you genuinely believe that Hashem knows what our needs are, then the tefillah is unnecessary. But most of the commentators explain that the purpose of tefillah is for us to reach deep within us, to make that connection, to be able to understand what our needs are and to express them. And therefore, as a result, to be able to express gratitude for receiving those things. That's really, in essence, what prayer is all about. And therefore, when we talk about communicating fear of parents, we're not doing it because we want to stand on ceremony, we want to be respected because of ego and arrogance and all of this. It's really because we want to teach our children the right values. There's a story with Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, one of the great sages who passed away about 30 years ago. And the story goes as follows. He was on a plane, and he was with a grandson. And the grandson was taking very good care of him. He was attending to every need, whatever that might have been. And next to him was an elderly Jew, secular, had no real connection to Torah growing up. And he was amazed. Or maybe it wasn't Jewish even, I don't know.
No, he wasn't.
He wasn't Jewish. Okay, so another person, he was amazed by the respect that Rabbi Yaakov was receiving from the grandchild. And he said to him, how is it that you have that? My grandchild barely acknowledges me. My kids barely have anything. They don't want to even be in my presence, let alone taking care of me in such a way. He said, because in our tradition, we believe that we are one generation further removed from Sinai. Sinai was a seminal moment in Jewish history. Moses came down with the Torah. Every generation removed from that is one generation further away from that moment. And therefore, we are intrinsically dependent on the previous generation to be our link, to be our connection, to be our sense of belonging. And therefore, we inherently have a level of respect for them because they are one step closer to the real thing than we are. You, on the other hand, subscribe to this concept that all man comes from an ape and from some other type of less developed species. In that regard, we, the later generation, are more sophisticated, more developed, more detached, so to speak, from that than the previous generation. And therefore, why should we respect you? We're more sophisticated, more developed, more advanced than you ever were. Leaving alone the details of that on a more philosophical basis, the point is we're able to communicate, if we choose to, who we are, where we stand, why it's important to provide that kavod. And in so doing, if the children hear it and they respond to it, ultimately we're helping them. We're not just, so to speak, helping ourselves. But when you do it, of course, you have to do it with gentleness. The Vilna Gaon, again, he was talking in the 18th century. He said, when he's writing on his deathbed to his children, guide them only with gentleness. For Torah learning is instilled within a person only through an approach of sincerity and gentleness. So even though we have to be that instructor, even though we have to be that source, we have to know how to present it. Now there's a fascinating story. Untitled Chapter, once, who was one of the great Torah scholars of the last generation, a contemporary in many ways with Rabbi Kamenetsky. One time, a person came to him and said, you know, I have a child who really needs to work on his character. He has a problem that I feel he needs to develop. And I asked him to learn with me so I can help him, and he refuses to do so. And so the Stabler said, don't tell him that. Tell him that you want to work on your own midah, you want to work on your own character, and say you need a chavrusa, and say that you need a study partner. And in that way, you bring him in through the back door, and you get him into it. And once he's into it, then hopefully it'll solve itself as you continue in the learning. So we have to know how to present it with gentleness, not always in a direct way. Kids today, oftentimes, we don't want to be told, none of us want to be told that we have a problem. None of us want to be told. If you read Dale Carnegie, you read anyone who talks about engaging and interacting with people, you always have to find a gentle way by which to bring ideas and thoughts to a child or to anyone in order to make it work. Now, if a child does something, right, and you have to give them musar, you have to give them rebuke in some way, try to find a way to not end it with that harshness. There's a story with Rabbi Abraham Twersky of Pittsburgh, who's a noted psychologist as well as a psychiatrist, as well as great Torah scholar. And he tells a story that when, I think it was him, when he was a child, he was a chess prodigy. And he loved to play chess. And another rabbi comes in, it was Rosh Hashanah. Maybe the other rabbi wasn't so observant, I don't know. But he asked the child to play chess with him on that day. And Rabbi Twersky's father and in their family, they didn't play chess on Rosh Hashanah. It was a day of thinking about God and anointing him as our king and all of this. A day of reverence. A day of reverence, you don't play chess? But the kid couldn't help himself. He was challenged by the rabbi, so they played the game. Father calls him in. Is it true that you play chess? He said, yes. He said, you know, whatever he told him, we really don't do that type of thing. And then at the end he says, but I heard you checkmate at the beginning. Right? And he ends with a smile. And then he ends the conversation. So I still love you. I'm still there for you. I want you to know that I'm always going to support you. You messed up, and that's okay. These things happen, but don't lose that. Don't send him off with that negative taste. That now I'm sort of in a cloud for a period of time. And that, by the way, is true for any spousal relationship as well. Oftentimes we get in fights with one another, and the easy thing to do is to sort of walk away with the perspective of being right. You know, it's totally, it's tangentially related. It's such a beautiful idea. I heard from somebody not that long ago, the difference between adults and kids is that kids prioritize being happy over being right. And adults prioritize being right over being happy. Which is why when kids get into a fight, 5 minutes later they're back into it again with their friends. They're reconnecting with their parents. I hate you, Mom. I hate you, Dad. 5 minutes later they're back with you again. But an adult can get into a fight and they're going to be right. And if they have to be right, that could be years of not talking. That could be years of stewing over the issue, whether the issue is an inheritance gone bad, a business deal gone bad, some other issue that may have occurred. And we as adults have a tendency to hold on to things because we must be right. And being right could be a very negative thing in the grand scheme of things. Better in most cases to be happy. Better in most cases to be b'shalom, to be in a state of peace, where the lines of communication are open and you're able to continue to engage with that person, than to stand on ceremony and say, I was right, and that's it, and until you admit it, there's nothing to talk about. How sad is that, but how often do we see it? And that can be the situation with our children as well, if we're not careful. So that's the CH of character, and the I to be that source of instruction, and in many cases of inspiration. N stands for make it needs-based, which means to make it personal. We have to find the time, as busy as we are, to spend uninterrupted time with our children. We need to be there for them. There's a story of two rabbis that were sitting at a chasana, at a Jewish wedding, and one of them was the kind who would get there at the very beginning, stay for a long period of time, and when he would leave, people would say, you're leaving already? And then there's a second rabbi, he was there for much less time. He'd come well into the ceremony, he would leave even before the other rabbi, and people would say, wow, it was so great that you came. Thank you so much for being here. So Rabbi 1 turns to Rabbi 2 and he says, how do you pull it off? I'm here for 2 hours, and they think I'm leaving. Well, why are you leaving so early? And you're here for 15 minutes, and everybody's so excited that you were here, and they're thanking you for showing up. And he says, very simple, because when you come, it's very clear you're not really wanting to be here. So you have your sfarim out, you have whatever you're doing, you're not really engaged in the process. So you're physically here, but you're not really there. I, on the other hand, I make it my business to dance. I make it my business to say Mazel Tov. I make it my business to engage in conversation. I use the 15 minutes very strategically and very pointedly for the purpose of engagement and connecting, because I don't have a lot of time. But minimally, if I'm going to be there, I want it to be time well spent. And that, I think, is an idea that we have to connect with our children as well. We talked briefly about being at the dinner table and having our devices available, right? There are many families where the TV is on when you're eating dinner, or these kinds of things. Whatever you can do to disconnect. As important as the news is, there are other ways to get the news. As important as the sitcom is, there are other ways to get it or not get it. But you can never replace that connection with the child. And if we're as busy as I think many of us are, we don't have too many opportunities. We don't have all that much time before the kids run off to do other things, or we have to run off and do other things. So the time that we do have with them, make it uninterrupted, and create other opportunities as well. Go out for one-on-one dinner, cup of coffee, ride, whatever it might be. Finding the way by which to engage, and let them know that you care. I'm going to skip ahead of a couple of other stories, but I'm looking at the clock. I want to make sure I can get you to the next session on time. U stands for show unconditional love. Unconditional means that at the end of the day, I might not approve of everything that you do. There are times that we're going to disagree, but that can never compromise the fundamental love that I have for you. And that has to be communicated in word and in deed. Stephen Covey, one of the great leadership thinkers who just passed away recently, uses an analogy of glasses. Right? He has a strong prescription, goes over to the next guy, he says, here, try on these glasses. Seems like you can't see all that well. And the guy puts them on, and he's really uncomfortable because the prescription is too strong, and he's not really feeling right, and he says, just work at it, try harder. Right? Just go, how about if I move it a little bit like this? And no matter what he does, and all of the coaxing, and all of the encouragement, quote unquote, and all of the reprimand, nothing is going to change the fundamental engagement with the glasses, because the wrong prescription is the wrong prescription. And we need to know that every child is different. And we need to know that not every child will conform exactly to the expectations that we set to them. We obviously want to give them our job, Rav Dessler says this very clearly. Our job as parents is to put them in the right position to succeed. At some point they become mature, they have to do it on their own. Yeah. And so therefore, as a result, we have to realize that no matter what they choose, we have to love them unconditionally. And finally, because I just got my cue, I think, a moment ago, the final CH. The final CH, and I think this is particularly appropriate for today as Erev Chanukah, is we have to act like Hashmonah. We have to act like the Hasmoneans, which in many ways is a summary of what we talked about. Number one, you have to know what's at stake. When Matisyahu got up with his sons, and they said, Mila Hashem Elai, they recognized that the future of Torah Judaism was at stake. Now is not the time to sit back. And if we realize, once upon a time, maybe you could say, it takes a village to raise a child. And maybe today we can still rely a little bit on that village. But the village has gotten much more complicated than it used to be. And so therefore the responsibility of parenting today, I think, may be stronger than ever before, because we can't rely on the community around us as we once did, because it's so vast. And the community goes well beyond the physical limitations of a normal community. Our kids are engaging today with people all over the world potentially. So we have to be there as their anchor. We have to know what's at stake, recognize that now is the time, as the Torah says, Eis lasos la'Hashem keferu torasecha. Now is the time to act for God, because the Torah is in effect at stake. And that's really the challenge that we've had so many times in Jewish history in various ways. And with parenting, I think that's relevant to today. The second point, as we talked about before, the Hashmonaim were about Mesiras Nefesh. They gave up of themselves. They were willing to put their lives out for a value that they held to be higher than them, and really at the essence of their future and their Jewish identity. And so we have to be willing to do that as well, and to communicate that Mesiras Nefesh. We have to talk to our children about the decisions that we make. We have to talk to them about the hardships. But we do this anyway because we feel that this is important. We don't go on that vacation because we need to prioritize your Jewish education, and the tuition has a cost attached to it, or whatever that might look like. And you actually express to them that you're making difficult decisions, ultimately for their benefit, ultimately for their sake. And then finally, and I point this out often when I talk about Chanukah, we think of Yehuda Maccabee, maybe we have different visions in our mind of what he looked like, of his physical skill set, and all of this. And I bet he didn't look all that much different than many of us in the room in terms of he wasn't certainly, I don't think, the type of warrior that oftentimes comes to mind. But what we know about Yehuda is that no matter how much success he had in the battlefield, no matter how much he was able to accomplish, time and again, and it's written explicitly in the book of Maccabees, time and again, he turned to God for salvation. Time and again, he died. Because he recognized that no matter what you do, no matter how wonderful you can be as a parent, there's so much that's beyond your control. When the Chafetz Chaim, the great sage, was given the Sefer Tehillim, the book of Psalms of his mother, which was almost unreadable because the books had been saturated with tears that brought tears to his eyes. He said, you have no idea how many prayers my mother said over and again so that her little Yisrael Meir, which was his given name, should grow up to be a Talmid Chacham. And he wasn't exactly the most rebellious type of kid out there. He's a pretty good kid. But you have no idea how much I prayed, she prayed, so that I would become something in life. And so all of us need to recognize that no matter what we do with all of the strategies and all the beautiful things, and all of them can be helpful, at the end of the day, we need to rely on Hashem to help us as well. And if we daven on a regular basis, if we make that connection, we understand that we are partners. We are partners in that relationship. We see that in the Aseres Adibros. We see that in other places. We are partners with God to raise a child. And if we tap into that partnership and we ask for help, that we should have the right words to say, the right ideas with which to engage, the right behaviors through which we can help a child figure it all out and navigate to a person of stellar character, of fine connection and commitment, then hopefully we can all come out as parents and say that we really did our job most effectively. So on this day of Erev Chanukah, as we have many ideas that I'm sure are flowing through your mind, all the beautiful sessions that you've gone to over Shabbos, and again later on this morning, one thing hopefully that all of us can take away is that we have the ability to make a difference. We have the responsibility to make that difference. And hopefully if we can take some of these ideas to heart, together with all of the other things that I'm sure you're already doing, then hopefully all of us can come out as better parents for the sake of our children and for the sake of Klal Yisrael.